Hey RVCC Online, thanks for joining us today. If you're currently with us live, I want to direct your attention to the chat box on the screen, and I want to give you all a couple minutes just to type in your answer to this question. What are some of your favorite hobbies? I'll be with you in just a bit. So one of my favorite hobbies and go-tos is video games. And one of my favorite video games of all time is this thing you may have heard of, or most of you may not have heard of it. It's called BioShock, which I think tells a very theologically accurate story on human nature. And let me explain what I mean by that. BioShock is a story about how a bunch of rich people who are obsessed with the philosophy of Ayn Rand build an underwater utopia called Rapture. And one of their beliefs was that if they leave religion behind on the surface and they all go underwater and build this Atlantis-like city, then everything would be better and nobody would miss religion. That's not all they believe, but that was one of their core beliefs. Unfortunately, Rapture turns out to be a complete disaster. And if you ever want to talk about why their commitment to Rand's objectivism doesn't work for human flourishing, let me know on your connection cards and we can grab coffee and talk about BioShock and Rand and objectivism and all that. But what I want to point out for today is that all the people who moved to Rapture to be free of religion, interestingly enough, they started their own religions. And so if you go throughout the game of BioShock, you'll see some people worshiping the Great Chain, and other people created cults like the Rapture family and the Saturnine and so on and so forth. And I know I'm losing you here, but stick with me because here's what I want to get at. What BioShock gets right is that you can try to get away from religion all you want, but at the end of the day, you will always worship something. And that's what happens in the game. And I think that's what happens in our lives as well, because every human has an inherent longing to behold, belong to, and be transformed by something that is greater than them. And that's why no matter the time, the place, the culture, wherever you find people, you're always going to find religion and you're going to find worship. So the question about human nature is not so much do people worship, because we all do, and if we don't worship something, we're worshiping ourselves. But the real question is, who are they worshiping? And there's a lot of options in the United States for objects or things to worship, right? We can worship wealth. We can worship our work. We can worship politics. We can worship family, nature, identity, security. We can worship BTS. We can worship the Los Angeles Lakers. We can worship ourselves and so on and so forth. But the problem is that though we have a plethora of what and who we can worship, the options that we are likely to choose leave us unsatisfied, misformed, and misdirected. But the claim of Christianity is that there is someone you can worship, and this worship will actually satisfy the deepest longings of your soul. And that someone is God, who has made himself fully present in Jesus. And while there are so many ways to worship this God, the one rhythm I want to focus on today is something called corporate worship, which is just a fancy way of saying going to church. And the reason why I want to look at this rhythm, this spiritual habit, is because it's sort of fallen out of fashion in our culture. According to Lifeway Research and Gallup, 56% of Americans reported that they seldom or never attend church. And what's interesting is that this trend is also seen in Christians. 43% of Christians seldom or never attend church for reasons beyond non-belief. In other words, 4 in 10 people who follow Jesus never stopped believing in Jesus, but they did decide to stop coming to church. And there's so many reasons for this, and we could spend all Sunday morning talking about the reasons why people have stopped going to church, and some of it is personal, and some of it has to do with the things that the church has done, and some of it has to do with cultural trends. But instead of unpacking all those reasons, I just want to answer the most basic question, which is this. Why does worshiping at church even matter? And I can't answer that question completely here, but I just want to give you at least 3 reasons to think about this week. And so let's start with reason number 1. I think going to church matters because our worship needs to be recalibrated weekly. As humans, we are worshipers. We will always look toward someone or something to enrich and give meaning to our lives. And this happens every day. This makes worship a powerful habit that can shape us for better or for worse, depending on the object of our worship. And interestingly enough, the book of the Bible that is all about worship, the book of Psalms, warns us about what misdirected worship can do to us. Read this passage with me here real quick. It comes from Psalm 135. It says this: "The idols of the nations are silver and gold made by human hands. They have mouths but cannot speak, eyes but cannot see. They have ears but cannot hear, nor is there breath in their mouths." And here's the key point. "Those who make them will be like them, and so will all who trust in them." Here's the gist of what this psalmist is saying. What you worship dictates who you become. You become like the idols you worship, or you become like the God you worship. Let me just give you an example of this. If you put all your trust and meaning into being secure, and therefore the object of your worship is security, you will eventually become a person who is always safe, but you will never become a person who truly makes sacrifices for your neighbor. Whenever your neighbor needs you, needs your love and your support, those things will always be contingent upon your level of security, and therefore, if you do offer to help, it will only be because it does not come at the cost of your well-being and security. Now, if you feel called out there, if you feel like that's not fair, I'm not trying to pick on you. Security is one of my favorite idols, and that's why I picked it. I struggle with it. I am daily tempted to worship security and to be shaped by security and to only love my neighbor so long as my security is not at threat. But in Sunday morning worship, I am invited once again to recalibrate just who I should be worshiping. And I think this is why followers of Jesus, since the start, made it a habit to gather together for worship. Because they needed it too, because they lived in an empire that was full of idols and gods, and so every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts to remind themselves, in a world full of gods, there's only one God. Now, I'm not saying this passage means we need to come to church 7 days a week, though my family members in South Korea do that. But the point I want to make is that if the early church and even South Koreans recognized the need to worship together every day, I think it's fair to say that we need it at least once a week. Because, at least for me, there needs to be one day I am reminded that the who or what that will enrich my life the most, that will give me the most meaning, that is most deserving of my trust, is not security, and it's not my family, and it's not the myriad of the other things that are presented to me, but it is God and God alone. And as I sing and pray and hear the word of God and receive his love through the waters of baptism and the breaking of bread and the pouring of wine, I am once again challenged to let go of the lesser things that I worship and be recalibrated to the God who created heaven and earth, and the God who loved me first in Jesus, and the God whose Spirit gives life to all things, including me, and the God who alone can satisfy my need and for worship, and who alone can satisfy all the hopes and desires of my heart. Now, you might be thinking, as you've listened to me just there, I agree with you, Joe, but why does it have to happen at 12305 Spanaway Loop Road? Or why does it have to happen on 224th? Or why does it have to happen at rainierview.org exactly at 10:30 a.m.? You might be thinking, I can listen to anyone I want on YouTube on my own time. I can listen to Maverick City Music on Apple Music. I can dip real bread in real wine in my kitchen, and I have at least 2 to 3 showers in my own house that can get cleaned way more regularly than the church baptismal, and we can do baptisms there. So why do I have to be here at church? Whether it's in a building or online, what's the point if we can just do it on our own time? And so here's reason number 2. I think we need to gather for church, and it matters because we need to recalibrate our preferences. But one of the central doctrines of the church is that God has always existed in community as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Now, how can 1 be 3 and 3 be 1 is a mystery that we cannot explain, but at least one implication is clear. The God of the Bible who has revealed himself in Jesus Christ is a communal God. He has always existed eternally in community. And if we want to worship this God, it doesn't make sense to do it alone. In fact, if we are worshiping and doing these things on our own, we are worshiping a completely different kind of God. And let me explain what I mean by that. If I do church on my own time and set the agenda based on what I want to do, then ultimately the God I'm worshiping is one of individualism. This is a God who happens to give me a sermon that I want to hear or is just challenging enough for me. A God where I only hear the songs and sing the songs I want to sing, where the discipleship next steps feel just right to me, and if I want to invite friends over, this is a God who gives me a congregation that is made up of people who I get along with and who are just like me. And I'm not saying good things can't come out of doing that, but what I am saying is that if you participate in something like that, that isn't the church that Jesus died to create. Let's take a look at what Ephesians 2 has to say about this. Read along with me here. If we look at Ephesians 2, starting at verse 11, it says this: "Therefore remember that formerly you who are Gentiles by birth and called uncircumcised by those who call themselves the circumcision, which is done in the body by human hands, remembered that at that time you were separate from Christ, excluded from citizenship in Israel, and foreigners to the covenants of the promise, without hope and without God in the world. But now in Christ Jesus, you who were once far away have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he himself is our peace and has made the two groups one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by setting aside in his flesh the law with its commands and regulations. His purpose was to create in himself one new humanity out of the two, thus making peace, and in one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he put to death their hostility." If you're confused why that passage in particular was chosen, stick with me here for just a moment. The Apostle Paul in that section is writing to the church in Ephesus, and he is addressing a culture which for the longest time did not have Jews and non-Jews, aka Gentiles, worshiping together or liking each other for the matter. And the point Paul wants to make to this church is that when Jesus died on the cross, he didn't just forgive all the sins of the world, although he did do that, and that's super important. But there's more that happened than just that. When Jesus was on the cross, ultimately what happened was that he reversed the curse of sin. While sin results in alienation from God, enmity with neighbor, and destruction of creation and the rule of death, the work of Jesus and the cross results in friendship with God, reconciliation with neighbor, renewal of creation, and the resurrection of the dead. So Paul's argument is that if Jesus has done all this, then the relationship between Jews and Gentiles can't be status quo anymore. They have been reconciled into one family, one new humanity. Or another way to say this is they have been gathered into one church to worship together, to serve together, and to learn how to love one another. But this isn't just limited to the relationship between Jews and Gentiles, right? Paul elsewhere writes that Jesus has changed the status quo of the relationships between the rich and the poor, slave and the free, men and women, and any other dividing factor that exists in the world. So let me get to my point here. Doing church on our own terms is not the same thing as doing church on Jesus' terms. One of those terms is being surrounded by those who he has redeemed and gathered into his one church. Monday through Saturday, we get to choose who we are around, who we spend time with, who we invest in. But on Sunday, it is God who chooses the community and not us. Now, I understand that in 2025, not everyone has Sunday off. Not everyone can make it into a building. So I want to be clear that what I am not suggesting is that if you can't be here physically or online, that you aren't worshiping. But what I do want to encourage you towards is gathering with the family that Jesus has created at least once a week. And it's going to look different for everyone, but let me just give you one example. If you're joining us right now on rainierview.org, I want you to be here, but just don't be here. I also want you to interact with other people on the chat. I want you to stick around for those Sundays where we have Zoom gatherings, and I want you to even look at joining one of our online community groups. Because Sunday worship isn't just about singing or learning new content. It's about being with Jesus' family. And doing so regularly is good for us, whether we're doing it online or in person, because when we worship and have fellowship with people who are nothing like us, we are recalibrated to recognize our fundamental identity and that of our neighbors is not what the world labels us as, but what God labels us as, and that is his children. Someone who captures that thought even more eloquently is Pastor Martin Luther King Jr., who once preached this. Now, somebody says to me, I'm sure that this is true and we don't have to go to church to worship. We can worship at home. We can turn on the radio. They have sermons on the radio on Sunday. And there are many experiences that we can have at home and out in the regulars, the avenues of life that will provide as much worship as we can get at church. But my friends, none of these can be substitutes for going into the house of God and worshiping God there. Why? Because worship at its best is a social experience where men come together in a deep sense of fellowship and where they forget themselves and where they forget their offices, where they forget their life's work and come here and meet the divine. And this is the beauty of worship. And at its best, men come and realize that they are the children of a common Father. The important thing is that we are united and one with him. I'll let King Jr. have the last word on that matter because I can't say it any better. So let's go ahead and move on to the last reason for why the church matters. Reason number 3, going to church matters because we all need to recalibrate our ultimate hope. Coming together for worship is different from any other thing we do during the week because it is something that some theologians call an eschatological act. I think we can have that in type here so you can see that word. Now, let me illustrate what that means because we might not encounter that word eschatological often, but I really think every person should have that in their vocabulary. So here's what I mean by eschatological. Think of it this way. Most people, if you're normal, go to the movie theater before the showtime because you don't want to miss the trailers. And the best trailers, like the Superman one that just launched a couple weeks ago, will get you excited for what is coming. You don't get everything in the trailer, but in a couple minutes, you do get glimpses of Clark Kent and Lois Lane, or is it Lois Lane, and Lex Luthor. And if you're a Superman fan, you're going to keep watching it and looking for clues of what might happen. And then finally, you'll go watch it when it releases in July. And either your wildest hopes will be fulfilled or it will be more disappointing than Batman versus Superman. So what we do at church, if it's aligned with Jesus' intentions, it's kind of like a movie trailer. It's a glimpse into the future where we are forgiven, where we are raised to new life, where we are gathered into one multi-everything family. And we recognize the rule and reign of the Lamb and celebrate for just 60 minutes or 3 hours, depending on traditions, that there is no dissonance between what life is and what life ought to be. Now, church is not the final product. Church is not perfect. We all know that. But it is meant to prepare us and excite us for what is coming next. And that's what eschatological means. It means something that points us to a hope and a future. And we need that. If not daily, then weekly, because if you're like me, we are so good at getting fixated on false hopes and false futures and false trailers for our lives that seem good enough, but are not substantial enough to carry us through for the long haul or shape us into becoming people who love God and neighbor well. In full transparency, sometimes the trailer I get most excited about is doing well at this job. It's maybe owning a home one day and having enough for retirement. And I'm not trying to say any of these things are bad things, but what I am saying is that these things can't be my ultimate hope. The American dream is nice and I want it, but ultimately it's not God's dream. And the trailer I need to get most hyped about is not the trailer that I've created for my own life or that the world is telling me is good for my life, but the trailer that I need to be most hyped for is the one we see in Revelation 21. If you go there and read verses 1 through 4, it says this. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne room saying, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. And he will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away." When I come to worship, I'm reminded that this future and this trailer is what matters most. And when it comes to all my hopes, I need to prioritize this one at the top because only Jesus' return and reign and not my job can truly fulfill me. And only a new heavens and a new earth and not home ownership can give me a true sense of belonging at home. And only a day with no more crying and pain and not retirement will truly allow my heart to rest. And here's the thing, if I start to believe this enough, if I buy into God's dream and allow it to become my own, then what I am reminded of Sunday is going to eventually change how I live Monday through Saturday. Because the priority won't be about more of me and what I want life to be, but it will be more about God and where he is taking the future and how I might participate in it. So if I can encourage you to take a next step this year, it's simply this: make attending church a priority. Because number one, church recalibrates who it is we worship from the things that cannot satisfy to the God who can. Number two, church recalibrates our preferences for what we like and who we like and exchanges it for Jesus' family. And number three, Church recalibrates our hopes and dreams, calling us to reprioritize God's vision of the future over our own. Now, those 3 reasons should be enough reasons, but if it's not, let me just leave you one last thought. If I told you there was just one thing you could do this year to reduce your risk of mortality by 55%, improve your overall physical and mental health, reduce your risk of divorce by 47%, and increase your capacity to be generous and compassionate by 20%, would you start doing that one thing? Of course you would. I would. So I'm not saying go to church for these additional benefits, but what I am saying is we shouldn't be surprised that there's a correlation between church attendance and health, because we, once again, are created to worship. And so when we worship, it's of course an eventuality that everything else about us is going to benefit as well. So again, let me just encourage you with this as we wrap up our time together. Make church a priority. If you're not attending church regularly, in person or online, think about what that could look like to make it a priority this year to do just that. And if you are attending but not a part of a community group and not investing time around the family of God, my challenge to you would be invest more time in the family of God this year and figure out what that can look like. And if you're perfect like Jeff Jamba and you attend church and you are already a part of a community group, then here's your next step. Jeff, you don't get to be off this year either. Here's your challenge, and here's a challenge for people just like Jeff. Is for you, your challenge is think about who in your life also needs the love of God in their life. Is it a coworker? Is it a neighbor? Is it a friend? Who in your life needs the love of God in their life? Make it your next step to invite just one person or one family to attend with you this year, whether in person or online. And make it doable for them if need be. If they need help with kids, provide it. If they need a ride, easy, give them one. If they need other perks, just buy them lunch. Jeff will pay for it. Maybe, I don't know. I'm joking about the last part, but whatever your next step is, I encourage you to take it and to recalibrate your worship this year, not just because it's good for you, but because ultimately it will bring you in greater proximity with God and deepen your relationship with Him.